Most people think wealth changes all at once. It does not. It changes at thresholds. That is the truth. Most beginners never hear clearly enough. They think becoming financially secure is a smooth staircase where every month feels a little better than the last. They imagine that if they are doing the right things, saving, investing, contributing, learning, the results should feel obvious and motivating from the beginning. That is not how it works. In the beginning, wealth feels almost insulting. You put money away. You say no to things. You stay disciplined. You watch the account inch forward. And still, most of the movement came from you, not from the money, from your labor, your restraint, your consistency, your sacrifice. That is why so many people quit before the curve bends. They mistake the slow phase for failure. So let me give you the one mother line that everything in this story serves. Wealth does not change your life when the number gets bigger. It changes your life when your money begins replacing your effort in stages. That is the line. Not one lucky investment, not one promotion, not one magical formula stages, because every meaningful wealth journey has a sequence. At first, you are carrying the system. Later, the system begins helping you. Much later, the system can carry more of your life than your job does. Those are not emotional milestones. They are structural milestones. Now, let me show you the mechanisms. The first mechanism is contribution dominance. This is the stage almost everybody hates. You are saving, you are investing, you are doing what the books and videos and financial experts say to do. And yet, when you look at the account honestly, nearly all of the progress came from what you personally put in. That is contribution dominance. It is not a sign that compounding failed. It is a sign that compounding has not had enough principle or enough time to matter yet. This stage is humbling because it feels like the money is lazy. You are doing the work. You are moving dollars from your paycheck into investments. You are cutting expenses, resisting upgrades, skipping convenience, making room, and the return portion still looks small enough to be almost rude. That is the trap. A lot of people reach this point and think the process is broken. It is not broken, it is embryonic. Wealth is behaving exactly the way it always behaves in the beginning. Small sums do not yet have enough mass to generate visible acceleration. That is why the first stage of building wealth is not really an investing challenge. It is a behavioral challenge. It asks whether you can keep feeding a machine that has not yet proven emotionally impressive. That is harder than people think. Now, let us move to the second mechanism. I call it proof of process. The first major threshold is not exciting because it makes you rich. It is exciting because it proves you can build capital. That is a different thing. 10,000 is not freedom. It is not retirement. It is not abundance. It is not even financial comfort in the full sense. But it is proof. It proves that the person can delay gratification. It proves that the account is no longer theoretical. It proves that investing is now behavior, not aspiration. It proves that some amount of money now exists outside immediate consumption and inside future compounding. That is why I treat the first threshold as psychological infrastructure. Not because the number itself changes the world, because the person who reaches it has crossed from intention into evidence. That matters enormously. People who have never built capital imagine future wealth as a personality trait. Other people have. Once they build the first real pile, even if modest, the story changes. They no longer have to imagine that they might become someone who invests. They are already doing it. Their money story stops being hypothetical. That is proof of process, and proof changes behavior more than encouragement ever will. Now let us move, I call it tax-advantaged acceleration. One of the biggest misunderstandings in personal finance is that wealth is built only from how much you save. That is incomplete. Wealth is also built from where the savings are placed and what tax structures magnify them. And tax relief matters so much. They change the speed of the curve. If an employer adds money every time you contribute, the first threshold arrives faster. If tax relief increases what enters the account before compounding even begins, the first threshold arrives faster. If growth is sheltered or deferred from taxation for long enough, the entire machine becomes more efficient. That is tax-advantaged acceleration. And it matters because the slowest part of the journey is the beginning. Any mechanism that speeds the first threshold reduces the emotional distance between effort and proof. That can be the difference between a person staying in the game and walking away. People often treat pension contributions or tax-advantaged investing as dry administrative details. I do not. I treat them as force multipliers. They allow ordinary savers to achieve the psychological breakthrough of visible capital sooner than raw effort alone would allow. That is not a side issue. It is one of the main engines. Now let us move to the fourth mechanism. I call it compounding visibility. The second threshold is where the machine starts becoming visible. This is the 100,000 moment at that point. The account is no longer a tiny pilot light. It is beginning to produce heat. That does not mean you are finished. It means the relationship between your effort and the portfolio's effort changes meaningfully. The portfolio starts having months and years where the gain is large enough to feel real, sometimes wonderfully real, sometimes painfully real on the downside, but unmistakably real. The account is no longer only a container for your deposits. It is now an organism with momentum that is compound. This is why people who reach six figures often describe a mental shift for the first time. They can imagine the money continuing to work even if they had to slow their own contributions for a season. A house purchase, a child, a job pivot, a sabbatical, travel, something else in life can interrupt the perfect contribution path, and the whole future does not immediately collapse. The portfolio has enough mass that time itself now does more work. That is a profound change, not because 100,000 is freedom, because it is the first level where wealth stops feeling purely hand to mouth and starts feeling self-propelling. That is the difference between pushing a stalled car and driving one already moving. I call it labor relief. This is where a lot of people misunderstand wealth entirely. They think the point of wealth is luxury. Sometimes it buys luxury. That is not its most important power. Its most important power is relief. At the 100,000 stage and beyond, your labor is no longer solely responsible for future progress. You still matter enormously. Your income still matters, your discipline still matters, but the portfolio has begun to absorb part of the burden. That means if you need to take your foot off the gas briefly, the system does not die. That means your future is not perfectly correlated to this month's paycheck. That means your life begins to contain a little more optionality. That is labor relief. This is why I reject the shallow view that six figures are only meaningful because of status. Status is a child's reading of the number. The adult reading is that money has begun sharing the load. It has started doing some of the future work itself. That changes how people walk through the world. They negotiate differently. They panic less. They plan further ahead. They take opportunities more seriously. They stop experiencing every financial decision as an emergency referendum on survival. That is worth more than social bragging rights. Now let us move to the sixth mechanism. I call it optional work. The final threshold is where the game changes completely. This is the $1 million threshold, though the true meaning depends on age, spending needs, geography, taxes, and expectations. I am not interested in pretending 1 million means exactly the same thing to everybody. It does not. But structurally, it marks the point where invested capital becomes capable of producing enough annual growth or sustainable withdrawal power that work is no longer the sole obvious pillar beneath the person's life. That is optional work at this level. The portfolio is not merely helping. It is competing with labor. A normal market year can produce more than many people earn from their jobs. A disciplined withdrawal rule can finance a meaningful lifestyle. A continued working life becomes a choice about preference, security, identity, and ambition, rather than simple necessity in the old sense. That is why the final threshold feels so different. Not because the account has 7 digits, because the hierarchy between labor and capital has changed. For most of life, labor is the parent, and capital is the child. At this stage, capital becomes old enough to stand on its own. That is the true milestone. Now, let us move to the seventh mechanism. I call it time leverage. This is the most merciless and beautiful rule in the whole process. The earlier these thresholds are reached, the more time becomes an ally instead of a spectator. That is why front-loading matters so much. A person who reaches the first threshold early gains more years of compounding. A person who reaches the second threshold early can, in some cases, ease off the accelerator later and still arrive in strength. A person who reaches $1 million with decades left before old age owns something almost absurdly powerful, time plus mass. That is time leverage. It is not simply that the money grows. It is that every future year of growth happens on a larger base, with more reinvestment, more compounding, and less dependence on the person's immediate sacrifice. That is why the curve stops looking linear. It bends because time is amplifying a machine that now has enough size for time to matter. This is also why the beginning hurts so much. In the beginning, time is helping, but the base is too small for that help to be visible. Later, the same number of years feels almost magical, because the base has become large enough that the unseen work finally becomes dramatic. That is not. It is delayed visibility. Now I want to force the identity shift, because without it, this whole story still sounds like a motivational chart instead of a structural map. Stop thinking like a saver. Start thinking like a threshold builder. A saver focuses on this month's effort. A threshold builder focuses on what changes when the machine reaches the next weight class. A saver asks, how much can I put in? A threshold builder asks, what stage am I in? Contribution dominance, visible compounding, or optional work. A saver thinks the number is the prize. A threshold builder understands the number is really a shift in the relationship between labor, capital, and time. That is the stronger identity, because once you see it that way, motivation becomes less fragile. You stop expecting every month to feel rewarding. You understand that each phase has its own job. The early phase proves process. The middle phase proves acceleration. The later phase proves independence. That is the sequence. And now let me give you the operating system plainly. First, stop despising the early stage. Contribution dominance is not failure. It is the required foundation. Second, attack the first threshold with every lawful advantage you have. Employer matches, tax wrappers, pension contributions, consistency. All of it matters more than people think. Third, do not sell the machine just because it still feels small. 10,000 is not freedom, but it is proof. Fourth, once the account reaches 6 figures, protect the process. This is where compounding becomes visible and interruptions become less fatal. Fifth, understand that 100,000 is not the finish line. It is where money begins sharing the load. Sixth, treat 1 million as a work, optional milestone, not a vanity number. The real question is what level of spending and freedom that capital can support. Seventh, remember that time multiplies thresholds. The earlier you reach them, the more disproportionate the result becomes. That is the heart of it. Most people think wealth is a single destination. It is not. It is a series of doors. And behind each door, and money changes. Now, let me end where this really matters. You can keep looking at slow progress and deciding it means nothing. You can keep postponing the first threshold because it feels too far away. You can keep telling yourself that until the account looks impressive. The effort is not really doing anything, or you can do the harder thing. You can accept that the first stage is mostly you carrying the machine. You can keep contributing long enough to prove process. You can push until compounding becomes visible. You can keep going until work becomes optional. And you can let each threshold change your life in the order it was always meant to. That is the threshold. Because the people who seem to wake up one day and discover their money is finally working for them did not arrive there by luck. They crossed doors other people quit in front of. That is the mirror. Look into it carefully. If the journey feels slow now, that does not mean the transformation is not happening. It means you are still carrying the machine to the point where it can finally begin carrying you.